Okay, so this is going to be the last week before your second practical. This is the last bit of information that will be on your practical. So it's a really pretty simple, straightforward lab. The worksheet that I just handed out is what you're going to work on today. So it's on joints. Most of this should be kind of a review from lecture. Hopefully it sounds somewhat familiar. Before I get into this, like really brief PowerPoint, just basically the terms that you need to know from this lab, I do want to talk a little bit about the practical. So it'll include basically the whole skeleton. So it's labs 7 through 10, which this is 10. 7, 8, and 9 are all the skeleton. I put a study guide on Canvas for you. So what you kind of need from each lab. Labs 8 and 9 basically, I just said know all of the terms from those handouts that I gave you on the skeleton. So the axial and the appendicular skeleton, be able to identify them on actual models. So that's why I have the bone models out today. This is a random selection of terms that you can kind of practice finding on these models as sort of a review. I'm not going to do any kind of formal review. But if you have questions about any of the bones or the bone markings, obviously let me know. This is not all you need to know. I want to make that clear, right? These are not all of the terms that you need. You need far more. You need to know far more terms from those 2 handouts that I gave you. So those are both on Canvas. I noted them in the study guide, so make sure you look at those. For the practical, I'll basically give you that entire list, just a list of a bunch of words dealing with bones. You'll carry it around to the different stations that I have set up. And there will be bones at each station with numbers on them like last week. And you'll identify either the bone or that part of the bone. For the joints stuff, these questions, it'll be more just, you know, a straightforward kind of exam type question on paper. The vast majority of the practical will be bones and identifying parts of bones. Okay, so I think that's all. Do you guys have any questions about the practical for next week?
Are we able to do the extra credit in one showing next week, or does it have to be the week before?
The week before, yeah. So if anyone has that, once I get done with this, definitely show me the review sheet. Yeah, but the idea is to read it and get prepared for the lab beforehand. So that's what I've been doing. Okay, the practical will be 50 questions, just like the last one. So 1 point per question, probably multiple questions per like each bone that I have set out. All right. So into lab 10. Oh, let me pull this up. Okay, like I said, hopefully this is mostly a review for the joints, some of these terms. So in your lab manual, it kind of lays out the classifications of joints in a somewhat straightforward, kind of nice, shrunken down manner compared to what we did in lecture. So there's a structural classification and functional. Structural just means what's it made of? Is it made of collagen fibers? So collagen fibers, if so, it's fibrous. Is it made of cartilage? If so, it's cartilaginous. And then all the rest are synovial. So synovial joints are those joints that have a cavity in between 2 bones. It's filled with synovial fluid. There's articular cartilage. It's a pretty complicated joint when you get into the synovial joints. So this is the sort of, the structural, what is it made of kind of classification. So you want to know those 3 terms. And in your lab manual, you have examples of different types of fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints on page 110 in table 10.1. And that's part of what you're doing today. So on this handout, you're going to list, I gave you an example of 4 different joints. You're going to list what they're classified as structurally, and then also their functional classification, which is the next slide. So the functional classification is basically how much do they move? Do they not move at all? Do they move a bunch? Or do they move a little bit, kind of in between? So structural and functional classifications. So functional or movement classification, you can have an immovable joint, which is a synarthrosis, sort of kind of slightly movable joint, kind of in between. That's an amphiarthrosis. And a fully movable joint is a diarthrosis. So the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Just because you have a fibrous joint, it doesn't mean it's necessarily one or, well, it doesn't mean it's necessarily synarthrosis or amphiarthrosis. You can have both of those. So that's laid out kind of nicely in table 10.12. So you have 10.1 as well. You have the structural class on the left side, fibrous, cartilaginous, synovial. On the right side, you have the examples of different functional classifications within each of those structural ones. So one really important point is the synovial joint, the functional class of synovial. The structural class synovial only has freely movable joints in it. So all synovial joints are diarthroses. The other two categories have both synarthroses and amphiarthroses. So check out that table and look at those examples so you kind of have an idea of those different types of joints. Okay. Just like in lecture, synovial joints are kind of one of the more important aspects of the joint chapter. You want to know the anatomy. These are the terms you want to be able to identify on a diagram of a synovial joint. Joint cavity, cartilage or articular cartilage, the joint capsule, and synovial fluid. And there is a diagram on page 112 in your lab manual. It has some extra terminology that you don't have to worry about. Just know those terms for the anatomy of the synovial joint. And finally, with synovial joints, you want to know those 6 different categories. So we talked about these in lecture: plane, hinge, pivot, ellipsoid, saddle, ball and socket. They give some examples on page 112 at the bottom of each of those. So as you're going through this, I think I put 2 synovial joints on here for your own knowledge. I mean, you don't have to do this, but think about what types of synovial joints those might fall into, like what category. And then finally, I know I'm flying through this, so tell me if you want me to slow down, but it looks like everyone's kind of working on the worksheet already. So the last part of this lab you want to know are the movements. So those are the definitions are on page 113. And then there's some really, I guess, helpful, I find them helpful pictures of a lady doing these movements on the next couple of pages, 114 and 115 in your lab manual. So you want to be familiar with all of these terms. I think we went over, and hopefully Dr. Schmitz has gone over them in lecture, or at least is getting towards them. We went over all of these, talking about them in relation to movement kind of away from or back towards 0 position. So be able to give examples, and that's where the second part of this worksheet kind of comes into play. I'm asking you for the joints involved in a couple of different really common activities. So walking up the stairs and then pushing a door open. So one kind of lower body movement, one upper body movement. So just tell me the joints. You can give me the formal name like tibiofemoral for the knee, or you can just say knee. I don't really care which one. For lecture, you'll want to know the formal terms as well as the common ones. But in here, if you just say knee, that's fine. And then also the motions that happen. So is your leg extending? Is it flexing? Is your ankle doing something? Is there dorsiflexion or plantar flexion happening when you're walking up the stairs? So think about the movement of all of the joints involved in each of those movements using these terms, telling me what motion each joint is undergoing, or parts of, the limb, if you want to think of it that way. So what I mean when I'm talking about walking upstairs, like the whole process of lifting your leg up, right? So lifting your leg up, pushing up, straightening your leg, and then kind of pushing off of your back foot. So there's a lot of different movements involved and multiple joints happening, or multiple joints involved in stepping up a stair. Okay. So that's it. That's the material that will potentially be on the practical next week from this lab. So this PowerPoint I've put on Canvas. So you have all of these terms that you need to focus on, along with the study guide. I think I put the terms in the study guide as well. So they should be there. And that wraps up the really quick intro to this joints lab. So for you guys can work on that worksheet together separately. It doesn't matter. I have the key once you're done. If you have questions about anything, let me know. You can come check your answers and then use the rest of the time to review kind of on your own. So it's totally up to you if you want to. This is the last time you'll be able to look at the bones before the practical next week. So use it if you want to. So up to you.
I have a question about the review from this lab.
Oh yeah.
This one, is one joint between the axis and the pelvis?
Hang on, let me pause.